Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And, if I don't mind saying so, I think we've got a fun little episode for you today, as we go back and rank the studio albums by one of my top 10 favorite bands of all time, Bay Area pop punksters, the Mr. T Experience. Now, the Mr. T Experience formed in Berkeley, California in 1985, and seeing as this is probably the third or fourth time I have brought the Mr. T Experience onto this channel, for today's episode I will spare you my entire spiel, but I will tell you that this is a band that I first discovered back in 1996. Not long after I moved to the Bay Area from my hometown in Northern California, I had an opportunity to see this band live, and there was just something about their live performance that immediately drew me in. So much, in fact, that the very next day I ran out to one of my local record stores. It was the Amoeba on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, to be precise, where I found a copy of the band's first LP, Everybody's Entitled to Their Own Opinion, on CD. I picked it up, took it home, listened to it, and I was immediately hooked. In virtually no time at all, I had become a huge fan of this band. This is a band that I would defend at all cost, a hill that I was more than willing to die on, and for some reason, this was one of those bands that just became like my band. This was a band that I had discovered for myself. They were local, which I thought was really cool at the time. And if I'm being perfectly honest with you, this was a band that kind of helped get me through some dark times in my younger years. And when it comes to the Mr. T Experience at the end of the day, despite some of their, chicanery and silliness, there is blood in the music. And to me, that is vitally important when it comes to sustaining a relationship with any artist over the course of 30 years, and to this day, when I listen to this band, which is all the time, I still listen to this band in very heavy rotation, I'm immediately transported back to my 19, 20, 21-year-old self, roaming Telegraph Avenue, excited about my new surroundings, excited about life, excited about the prospect of getting turned on to new music. And I've been relatively lucky over the years. I've had an opportunity to see this band starting in 1996, probably 10 or 12 times over the years. And to me, this has always been one of the best live bands I've ever seen. They always come at you with a tremendous amount of energy. This is a band that I never one time saw mail in a show. That being said, I'm not exactly sure what the current state of the Mr. T Experience is. I hate the idea of this band not being active, at least in a very, very, sort of part-time basis. So if you haven't seen this band and the opportunity does present itself at some point in the future, this is a band that, in my opinion, you have to see live before it's too late. Like I said, I don't live in the Bay Area anymore. I don't necessarily have my finger on the pulse of what goes on out there, but if you pay attention to the band's social media outlets, I haven't really seen them advertise or promote any new shows in recent years. And even for me, it's probably been at least 10 years since I saw this band live. It was probably, if I had to guess, it was probably 2013 or 2014 the last time I saw this band live, and they were still great. So if you have an opportunity to see this band live and you haven't, please do yourself a favor and check these guys out live. Anyway, let's get into this ranking just a little bit. There are 13 studio albums on this ranking, and for me, this actually turned out to be much more difficult than I thought it was. When I first started this project a few weeks ago, I thought that this one would be relatively cut and dry, because going into it, I sort of knew what my least favorite record in the band's catalog would be, and I definitely knew what my favorite record in the band's catalog would be. So I thought that everything would sort of fall into place sort of in between those. But actually, this turned out to be pretty challenging and, to be honest with you, a little bit surprising as to where some of these records ended up, falling into place. And a lot of them were actually really close. Sometimes it came down to a song here or a song there that sort of tilted the scale in either one direction or another. Like I said, there are 13 albums on this ranking. There are some things on here that you may agree with. There are some things on here that you may not disagree with. But a couple things I got to get out of the way first that you will not see on this ranking list. One being from 2003, Dr. Frank released a mini album, a solo mini album called 8 Little Songs. That album is not on this ranking. For one thing, I don't even own a physical copy of that album, which is surprising. As I was sort of digging all of this music out of its shelving earlier today, I sort of discovered that I don't have that record on physical format. It wasn't really going to make the list. Anyway, I'll explain why in just a minute. Another record that you will not see on this list is the 5-song EP by the Mr. T Experience called The Miracle of Shame. Now, I love Miracle of Shame, but 5 songs to me is just a little bit too small to classify as an album. Now, that EP is totally snug. It is a record that I will talk about on this channel at some point in the future. And as I mentioned before, I've already brought the Mr. T Experience onto Archaic Records 3 or 4 times in the past before this episode. But rest assured that all of these albums that I haven't done episodes on yet in the past will be featured on this channel in the future, because this is a band that I cannot keep too far beyond my arm's reach. This is a band that I absolutely love, and I have, as I mentioned before, we're going on 30 years. I first discovered this band back in 1996. There are 13 albums on this ranking, so without any further ado, let's get into this. Number 13 for me, this record was released in 2004. It was produced by Kevin Army, and I got to tell you, before I even get into this record, that when I do these ranking episodes, especially when it's these bands and artists that I love so much, I always hate that any record has to be relegated as the sort of, bottom of the heap, the caboose of the train, if you will. But in the case of the Mr. T Experience, this one is easily my least favorite, and that is Yesterday Rules. Now, over the course of the Mr. T Experience career, this band has had several lineups over the past. This particular record features Dr. Frank, of course, along with Ted Angel on guitar, Bobby J on bass, and Jim Pittman on drums. And as I mentioned before, this record came out in 2004. It had been 5 years since the band released its last album, Alcatraz. So when this record was announced, I was extremely excited for it. I went out and I bought it the day it came out. I took it home. I listened to it. I listened to it again. And then I listened to it again. And each time I listened to it, I kept waiting for this record to sort of jump out of the speakers at me. And it just sort of never did. This is a record that even still to this day, I don't listen to very often. Now, it's not a bad record. The Mr. T Experience has never made a bad record. This record is not a felon, son. If this record is guilty of any sort of crime, to me, it's just that it's a little bit boring. It sounds a little bit uninspired. And as I mentioned before, the year before this record came out in 2003, Dr. Frank released a mini album called 8 Little Songs, and 4 of the 8 Little Songs also appear on Yesterday Rules. And so I remember when this record came out thinking like, okay, well, 4 of the songs on this record we've already heard from last year, and the songs that I haven't heard on this record aren't necessarily life-changing. Like I said before, this record feels a little bit uninspired. It wasn't too long after this record came out that Dr. Frank Portman went into sort of book mode, so I've always kind of wondered if his head and heart were fully invested in this record. It sounds as if to me that this record is a little bit, uninspired. It sounds as if it was almost a little bit of a chore. Like I said, this record does have some really good songs on it. The 4 songs that were included on the 8 Little Songs mini album by Dr. Frank are Jill, Big Strange Beautiful Hammer, London, and Boyfriend Box, which to me are 4 of the better tracks on this record. I actually really like the 8 Little Songs mini album a lot better than I like this one. Like I said before, the 8 Little Songs isn't included on this ranking, but I actually like it better than Yesterday Rules as well. There's some other good songs on this record. I like the song She's Not a Flower. I like the song Shining. Institutionalized Misogyny is pretty good, but if I had to pick a favorite song off Yesterday Rules, it would easily be Sorry for Freaking Out on the Phone Last Night. I actually really do like that song. That is sort of a quintessential MTX song. Like I said before, this record isn't bad. I don't really listen to it very often, and I assume that now that I have been listening to it a couple times over the past week, this record will probably resume its life quietly on the shelf where it gets pulled out maybe once a year, maybe once every 18 months. But for me, that is number 13 from 2004, Yesterday Rules. All right, number 12. This record came out in 1998, also produced by Kevin Army, and that is the band's Ramones tribute cover record, Road to Ruin. Now, I actually really like this record a lot. I like this record much more than Yesterday Rules. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I sort of knew what my favorite record would be, and I knew what my least favorite record would be, and it was sort of in between that gray area where I had to kind of figure out where things went. Yesterday Rules is by far my least favorite record, and the only reason why I would say that this one is number 12 is because it is a cover album. I said the same thing when I ranked the Morrissey catalog when it came to California Sun. I love California Sun. It's a record that I listen to all the time, but in the Morrissey catalog, it got ranked relatively low based on the fact that it's a cover album, and so I will sort of, in the spirit of consistency, I will sort of penalize Road to Ruin for the same thing. Now, this is a wonderful tribute to what is an all-time classic record in the history of punk rock. Dr. Frank Portman, of course, is famously a very huge Ramones fan. I think he does the band a tremendous service with Road to Ruin. But for me, it is number 12. Like I said, it's only because it's all covers. If you haven't listened to the Mr. T Experience version of Road to Ruin, though, you should do yourself a favor and listen to it, because I think it's pretty snug. Honestly, they do a really good job covering those songs. All right, number 11. For me, this record came out in 2016. It's an album that I just did an episode on a couple weeks ago. It is the Mr. T Experience concept album called King Dork, approximately. Now, of course, this record is a concept album. It is a companion piece to Dr. Frank Portman's 2-volume YA series called King Dork, which the first one came out in 2006. And as I talked about on that episode, I was extremely excited when those books were announced, or at least the first book, King Dork, was announced by Dr. Frank Portman, because one of my favorite things about the Mr. T Experience, except for everything, is I love Dr. Frank Portman's songwriting. I love his use of the language. I love the way he sees the world. I love his observations. I love his sense of humor. I love his snottiness. And I remember thinking to myself, if there's anybody in the music scene that is capable of writing an entertaining and compelling YA book, of course, it's Dr. Frank from the Mr. T Experience, because if you go back and listen to these Mr. T Experience records, I mean, these are basically YA records, generally speaking. But this is a record that I really do like. This was one that I was really stumped when I began this project as to where this record would land, because it certainly is better than some things in the catalog, especially Yesterday Rules, but it's certainly not as good as some of the stuff that's coming up. And the fact that this record is kind of a concept record, and this record kind of goes in different areas that you don't normally sonically associate with the Mr. T Experience, in my opinion, it lends it to becoming a record that I don't listen to quite as much. This album features, of course, Dr. Frank, with Ted Angel on guitar, Bobby J on bass, and Jazz Brown on drums. This album goes in a bunch of different directions. It's got some elements of like almost sort of proto-grunge, 70s hard rock, the typical sort of pop punk that you would expect with the Mr. T Experience. This album does have a lot of good songs on it. I like the song Cynthia with a Y. Sadistic Masochism is good. I don't love the title track, King Dork, approximately. I talked about this when I talked about the record, that the story in the book of how that song was written is interesting, but the song itself I don't love. I think, for one thing, he probably sets the world record for the amount of times that you can use the word approximately in a song, and after a while, it becomes distracting, and then a little while after that, it almost becomes kind of annoying. Still Not Done Loving You Mama is pretty good. There's an old song on here called O'Brien is Trying to Learn Hawaiian, which is a song I'd never heard of, which dates back to 1916. I'd never heard of that song until it was mentioned in the second book, King Dork, approximately. There's a whole story about the main character, Tom Henderson, trying to learn that song on the guitar. I actually kind of like that song. I like their version of it. Gooey Glasses is okay. High School is the Penalty for Transgressions, yet to be specified, is a good song. I Want to Ramon You is awesome. Robot Rag is kind of a cool, brief, instrumental acoustic jam. They do another version. They do a remake of an old Mr. T Experience song called King Dork, which I like. Down with the Universe is probably one of my favorite songs on this record. If you've read the King Dork books, you understand that the main character, Tom Henderson, I think a lot of these songs are sort of written through his perspective. That's the song that I most associate with the main character from the book, Tom Henderson. When I hear that song, I can definitely hear him singing it, but my favorite song off King Dork, approximately, is easily Thinking of Suicide. There's a story in the book where the main character, Tom Henderson, finds a pamphlet, which is sort of a suicide prevention pamphlet, and it's titled Thinking of Suicide with a question, and he takes the pamphlet home and he writes a song based on the pamphlet, and his parents, I don't remember in the book specifically if they find the pamphlet or if they find the song that he had written, but they immediately jump to the conclusion that he is a candidate for self-harm, and they send him into the care of a therapist who really, through a course of some conversations, ends up really sort of changing his life. I do like that album. I don't listen to it as much as some of the other stuff in the catalog. Sadly, at this point in time, this represents still, even though this record is almost 8 years old now. It's hard to believe. I mean, I know that's the biggest cliche thing you can ever say, so I apologize for saying it, but I can't believe that this record is almost 8 years old, and what it tells me, basically, is that it's time for some new music, fellas. I think that would be pretty snug. All right, number 10. We're in the top 10 already. See, you made it. We're like 2 minutes into this thing, isn't it? Anyway, number 10, from 1999, produced by Kevin Army. You sort of see a pattern developing here, don't you? That is the album Alcatraz. This album is featuring Dr. Frank, of course, along with Joel Reeder and Jim Pittman. This is my favorite lineup of the band. This is the band that I most associate with the Mr. T Experience based on my sort of personal experience with the band. This was the lineup that I saw live the most over the years. This is, like I said before, this is my, my favorite lineup of the band. I remember seeing this band probably between 1996 and 1999. I probably saw this band 7-8 times before, in September of 1999, I moved to Seattle, where I actually had one of my favorite times ever experiencing seeing this band live. It was not long after I moved to Seattle. I think it was in the spring of 2000. I think I had lived in Seattle for a few years, and I had, I was living in a new surroundings. I was I had this sort of new group of friends, and the Mr. T Experience were coming up to Seattle to play one of my favorite venues in Seattle, a place called Graceland. And it was such a cool experience for me because I got to take my friends from my new city, and I got to go see one of my favorite bands from back home. Now, I realize now, at this point in time, that moving from California to Washington isn't exactly globetrotting, but at the time, for me, I felt like it was a big move. I felt like I was a long way away from home. And this band, to me, represented what home was. And it was cool that I got to take a group of friends from my new city to go see this band live. We all had such an incredible time that night. All my friends loved this band. I think most of them at the time hadn't really ever heard of this band, but we had a great time. It was fun sharing that kind of your past with your present, and that was one of my favorite times seeing the band, at least not seeing them in the Bay Area. And of course, as I mentioned before, this band is always great live. Like I said, this album features Joel Reeder on bass, Jim Pittman on drums, and Dr. Frank. This is my favorite lineup of the band. This album comes in at number 10 for me. I like this record. It's about 60% to 70% really good. There is a tiny bit of clunkage on this song, but I gotta be honest with you and tell you that my least favorite Mr. T Experience song of all time happens to reside on Alcatraz, and that is the song Naomi. There's just something about that song I've never liked. I don't really understand what it is, but it's always been probably my least favorite Mr. T Experience song since it came out. But this album has a lot of awesomeness on it. It has a song I Wrote a Book About Rock and Roll, which is awesome. Self-Pity is cool. Two of Us is awesome. Our Days Are Numbered. We're Not No One is pretty cool. Perhaps I Feel For You, but man, if I had to pick a favorite song off Alcatraz, it would probably be She's My Alcatraz is pretty close, but I think I'm going to go with Tomorrow's a Harsh Mistress. It's probably my favorite song off Alcatraz, which is number 10 for me. Dr. Frank Portman, of course, released 2 albums in 1999. It was this album with the band and another album which we will get to at a certain point in time. This album, Alcatraz, is by far, in my opinion, the weaker of those 2 albums. So for number 9, we're going back to 1997. This album was also produced by Kevin Army, and that is the album Revenge is Sweet, and So Are You. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this was the first album to come out as sort of post my fandom was born. I remember being so excited when this record came out. I bought it on CD almost immediately, and I gotta tell you, I wore out my copy of this record. This is a record that I could not get enough of. Now, in 1997, I talked about this record in its entirety on a video on this channel about a couple months ago, and I talked about it when in 1997 it felt as if the Mr. T Experience were right on the verge of sort of catapulting themselves, onto that next, level. And as a young kid who had just sort of recently discovered this band and had become so invested in them, I had very mixed emotions about that. I mean, I wanted this band to succeed. I thought this was the best current band in the world, certainly better than any of the crap that you were hearing on commercial radio or MTV. But at the same time, this was my band, and you sort of had to be worthy, in my opinion, of liking this band. And I admit, I had just discovered this band probably a year before this record came out. So why I ever felt as if I was the gatekeeper is beyond me. But I sort of did. I felt like you had to be worthy of this band. And I did not love the idea of every person my age in the world being a fan of the Mr. T Experience. It just did not sit right with me. And in 1997, it was either right before or right after this record came out, my fears were sort of substantiated when the band was featured on the cover of BAM magazine. Like I said, I talked about this record in its entirety on a video before, but if you're unfamiliar with what BAM magazine Bam Magazine was a bi-monthly free music magazine in California. And in my opinion, this was one of the coolest magazines in the world. I mean, this was pre-internet. This is where we found out about live shows. They had excellent writers. They conducted really interesting, cool interviews. They talked about bands that were maybe a little bit, under the surface. And I got to tell you, when this issue of Bam Magazine came out, it sort of, I had, again, mixed feelings about it. I couldn't believe that these guys were on Bam Magazine. I mean, this was one of my favorite magazines in music, and it was free. And I remember I worked at a bakery out in the Bay Area, and literally right in front of our storefront, we had the Bam Magazine newspaper box. And I remember I took about 10 or 15 of these, and I ended up cutting them up and making a collage. Of course, I kept one in as pristine condition as it can be, considering how old it is. But I also did not love the fact that these guys were going to become like the next Green Day, man. I did not want them to be the next like hot topic band. Now, as an adult, or a semi-adult, I mean, this isn't really adult, can you imagine? I don't see myself as being a full-on adult. I don't ever want to be an adult. I can't imagine anything more sort of gross than being one of those guys who plays golf on Sundays talking about investing and Fox News. But as a relative adult, now I sort of wish that this band had, celebrated a little bit more success, because I do believe that this was the best band from that era. This band is better than Green Day. This band is better than Rancid. This band is better than NoFX. It's better than all of the bands that came out of California in the 1990s. But as a kid, it really twisted my panties when I thought about people who were unworthy worshiping at the altar of the Mr. T experience. I don't know why it bothered me so much, but it really, really did. But I love this record. This is a record, like I said, when it came out, man, I blew through a copy of this one. I wore this thing out on CD. Now it's kind of like, sort of like back third of their catalog. I really do like it a lot. It's very, very sentimental for me. This was probably my favorite era of seeing the band live. I remember I told a story on this channel when I talked about this album in its entirety, that I went to go see this band live one time. And there was a very snotty girl standing right behind me, and she was making comments based on the appearance of the band's bass player, Joel Reeder, and how he was trying to look like Sick Boy from the movie Trainspotting, which was still new at the time. And this chick behind me just would not shut up the whole time. I'm assuming, and I don't use this word anymore because I'm a man in his 40s, and it sounds sort of sad when you go around throwing around this word, but back in those days I used to chuck this word around a lot. But she was just probably a total poser. She probably had no reason to be there. And I picture her nowadays, wherever she is, living in a very affluent suburb with her investment banker husband, chauffeuring her puppies around in an SUV. She wasn't a true fan of this style of music. She wasn't a true fan of the Mr. T experience. That's what I was worried about. See, that's what I was worried about, was people like that infiltrating the Mr. T experience fan community. Now, on that same video, not to drop names here, but Joel Reeder himself commented on that video and told me that his hair was inspired the same way that my hair was inspired, and that was by the great Billy Idol. But he thought that the Sick Boy anecdote was somewhat amusing. Looking back on it, it was amusing. And Trainspotting is one of the top 5 greatest movies of all time. So calling somebody Sick Boy is not an insult. It's not. This is still a record, though, that I look back with just a lot of sentimentality. This is a semi-recent reissue, this particular copy of it. It's got the awesome orange vinyl. This record has a lot of good songs on it. The fact that this record is actually number 9 kind of does surprise me. This is one of those in the ranking that kind of surprises me, because this record is really good. It serves as a testament to the stuff that's coming up, because, the stuff coming up in this catalog is the jugs. I like the song Here She Comes. She's Coming Over Tonight is a song I always kind of get stuck in my own head when I think about it. Love is Dead is cool. Lawnmower of Love is good. The Weather Is Here, Wish You Were Beautiful is cool. I like the song Swiss Army Girlfriend. I Don't Need You Now. My favorite song on this record is has always been Hell of Dumb. It's got like a really cool like string guitar or string guitar. It's got a real cool kind of steel guitar breakdown on it. Maybe that's the Nashville in me now. But it also, I talked about this earlier, whenever I hear the word hella, it always makes me think of the Bay Area. I've always assumed that the word hella sort of took off in the Bay Area. There used to be a point in time when if you would hear somebody use the word hella, you sort of knew they were like a Bay Area, and I guess that's a little bit of geography slang history for you there, friends. All right, number 8. This album was released in 1993, produced by Kevin Army. This album is called Our Bodies. Ourselves, this album sort of features a revamped lineup of the Mr. T Experience. This album features Dr. Frank, of course, along with Aaron Rubin on bass and Alex. I can never pronounce his last name, so I'll just say Alex on drums. And for me, this is probably one of the most overlooked albums in the Mr. T Experience catalog, by myself included. I think that this album suffers from a little bit of middle child complex based on the album that came out before it and the album that came out after it, both being, I think, significantly better than this record. But this is a record that I do enjoy. This is, to be honest with you, this is probably one of the records that I do listen to a little bit less than some of the others, because there is better stuff in the catalog. I actually probably listen to this record less than Revenge is Sweet, even though I think it is a little bit of a better record than Revenge is Sweet, but it's got some awesome songs on here. I love Somebody Who Cares. The Dustbin of History is awesome. Personality Seminar. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. More Than Toast, which apparently, and I just actually learned this very recently, the song More Than Toast apparently was featured in a video game, which was the EA Sports NCAA Football 2006, which, yeah, makes perfect sense, right? I mean, you think of college football, you think of the Mr. T Experience? I don't think so. And I'm not really a gamer anyway, and I don't play NCAA Football 2006, but if I ever find it now at a used media store, I might buy it if it is on there, just to have it as part of the library, because yes, I'm that obsessed. My favorite song off this record, though, is Easy, and that is Even Hitler Had a Girlfriend. To me, that is one of the most quintessential Mr. T Experience songs of all time. Of course, it features Dr. Frank Portman's just his wonderful writing and his sarcasm and his self-deprecation. And I've been that guy. I can totally, when I hear that song, I can totally picture myself, being that sort of girl-obsessed, frustrated, awkward young lad, sitting in history class watching a film on World War II, and as they begin to describe Hitler's relationship with Eva Braun, instead of taking in the information as it's being presented to you, sort of being distracted by it. Of course. Yeah, even him. Yeah, look at me. I love this song. It is one of my favorite songs, probably in the entire catalog. I love the song when he says he was the worst guy ever. I love that song. So for me, that is number 8. Number 7. From 1986, this album was produced by Dr. Frank and John Vaughn. It is the band's first studio album. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Of course, a very sentimental favorite for me, because this was the first record I ever bought on CD. I went to go see this band live not long after I got into the Bay Area from my hometown up in Chico, California. And I remember when I went to go see this band live, not knowing who they were, having never heard of them. I remember being sort of confused, if not a little annoyed at their name. I thought that, these guys think they're really funny and clever. And I went to go see the show live, and as I mentioned before, it just blew me away. The very next day, I ran out to my local Amoeba Records in Berkeley, and I found this on CD, and I took it home, and I listened to it over and over and over, and just it hooked me. This is my gateway. This was my gateway drug into my Mr. T Experience fandom. I love the album art on this one. You know, this is a band that always has tremendous album art. Of course, this lineup features, Dr. Frank, along with, and I can never pronounce any of the original members' last names because they all have these horrible last names, and I'm the worst at pronouncing last names. So, of course, it's Dr. Frank, John Von Byron, and Alex, the original lineup. I do love this record. It is a little bit down on the catalog as far as I'm concerned in terms of the ranking, because there is stuff ahead of it that is better, but like I said before, that's not an indictment on this record. That's just a testimony as to what's coming up, because I still listen to this record all the time. This is a record that is played in my house on very, very heavy rotation. I like the song One Big Lie. Just Your Way of Saying No is cool. Sheep is awesome. I love their little Surfin' Mozart. Danny Partridge is one of my favorite songs in the entire Mr. T Experience catalog. I don't love the song Scientific. Disconnection is cool. Actually, Disconnection is really cool. I like that song. Paula Pierce, I don't know. I don't love that song. Big Mistake is awesome. I love their version of Pleasant Valley Sunday. That was always one of my favorite songs to see live. The Empty Experience is awesome, but my favorite song off this record is Marine Recruiter. To me, it's something that's very relatable. During my senior year of high school, I used to get those phone calls. I don't know if they still do that nowadays, but when I was a kid growing up, your senior year of high school, you start getting those phone calls after school from these like military recruiters. And I remember towards the end of my senior year, I got a phone call one day, and it was funny because my dad's wife answered the phone, and I had like no friends in high school. My phone did not ring, at least, in search of me. And I remember my dad's wife was like, Jamie, you have a phone call. And I was as confused as she was, and I picked up the phone, and I heard this guy's voice on the other line. Hey, Jamie, yeah, dude, bro, man. And it turned out he was a military recruiter. I think it was Marines. I forget the actual branch, but he sort of, because I was such a wuss and a nerd back in those days, he sort of cornered me verbally into making an appointment to go down to the recruitment office, which of course I had no intention of joining the military. I am not a military person, was probably even less of a military person when I was military age appropriate, but of course I ghosted him and I didn't show up. And later that day, after I didn't show up for my appointment, he called my house again, but his tone had completely changed. I was no longer Jamie Bro Dogster. I was like, listen, son, you wasted time of the federal government. I just want you to know that. But the song Marine Recruiter is probably my favorite song off this record. It talks about hiding from the telephone when the phone rings and basically saying, hey, Mom, if this guy calls, I'm not here. Pretend that I have friends. Pretend that I have a social life. I'm not here if that guy calls. Somehow the guy sort of, because I was afraid to say no to him, he sort of painted me into this verbal corner. I was like, oh yeah, I'll come down to your office tomorrow after school. Didn't show. Anyway, next song, or the next record after that, is number 6. This record came out in 1992, produced by Kevin Army as well, and that is the album Milk, Milk, Lemonade. This is a record that I really love. Now it's starting to get tough. See, now we're getting into the ones that was like a song here or a song there, and this is really where I kind of had no idea where some of this stuff was going to fall. But this record features Dr. Frank, of course, with John Alex, and then Aaron Rubin on bass, John on guitar, Alex on drums, and Aaron Rubin on bass. And this is another one of those records that, to me, has some of the best artwork in their catalog, which Of course, I think all of their artwork is awesome. I remember when I first bought this record, I just geeked out on the album cover for probably 2 hours just looking at all the different lunchboxes. I remember lunchboxes were like a huge thing when I was a kid. This is something that probably is dated and makes you sound like an old boomer, but I'm not a boomer, okay? Just saying that. The lunchbox I had, though, this style, I had one when I was in kindergarten and first grade. Mine was The Muppet Show. I'll never forget that. And other people made fun of the fact that I had The Muppet Show. Some people had Dukes of Hazzard. Some people had some other ones that they thought were more snug. But I had The Muppet Show, and I was obsessed with The Muppet Show. So I had no regrets on choosing The Muppet Show. But some of these are pretty cool. You got Gentle Ben. You got the Archies. That would have been cool. That would be one that I probably would have chose back then. Kiss. When I was in kindergarten and first grade, I think I was pretty scared of Kiss. I don't know if I would have gone. Kiss Brady Bunch is cool. Evil Knievel, that would have been cool. But, I mean, the coolest one's right there. That's the Mr. T Experience lunchbox. That would be cool if there was actually one of that. But this is a record that I love. This one could be higher, but it's just, again, there's so much stuff ahead of it in the quality department. But this is a record that I definitely plan on doing a full episode on because I love this record. I love the song Book of Revelation. What Do You Want? Ready, Set, Go, 2 Minute Itch, Master of the Situation is awesome. Of course, this album features the Mr. T Experience cover version of What Difference Does It Make by my main man, Mr. Stephen Patrick Morrissey, and the greatest band of all time, the Smiths. I think it's actually a pretty good version of it. There's also another good version of that same exact song by the band Face to Face off of their album Standards and Practices. They do a pretty good version of What Difference Does It Make too by the Smiths, but I have to give the nod to the Mr. T Experience. But if I had to pick a favorite song on this record, it's tough. This one's tough. I'm going to disqualify What Difference Does It Make because it's a cover, even though the Smiths are my favorite band of all time, but I'll say Christine Bactine. It's actually probably my favorite song on the record. I love that song. All right, now we're getting into the top 5. Now, this is when it was really getting pretty tough, I got to tell you. Like I said, number 1, I knew going in, but the rest of these got pretty tight. Number 5 for me, this album came out in 1988. It was produced by Kent Steedham. That is the band's second LP. Night Shift at the Thrill Factory. To me, this record is a huge leap ahead of the band's first record, Everybody's Entitled to Their Own Opinion, which I love. So that tells you that I love this record even more. The fact that this record is your 5th best in your catalog is really saying something, at least to me, because this record is the jugs. This record features the original lineup of Dr. Frank along with John, Byron, and Alex. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think this was the second record of theirs I ever purchased. And if buying Everybody's Entitled to Their Own Opinion hadn't made me a fan enough already, this record cemented my fandom because I did and still do like this record better. I love the artwork on this record. I've always loved that illustration on the back as well. This is a band that has just always just destroyed the artwork, at least in my opinion. But man, this album has the jugs on it. The song Now That We Are 21, Don't Need What'll, Predictable, Mine Is a Terrible Thing, Skating Cows, Go Away, What Is Punk, Velveeta. Man, I don't even know if there's really like a bad song on this album. I don't know if you could pick a weakest song off this album. As far as my favorite, man, that's tough. I love the song What Is Punk, but favorite. Now That We're 21, oh my god. I'm going to say Slag Bag. But now that I even say that out loud, I don't know. But I love this record. This is number 5. For me, my first episode, I talked about the Mr. T experience on this channel. I did kind of a 2-album episode where I talked about the first 2 records in their entirety. Sort of, I would take Night Shift at the Thrill Factory over. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but man, both those records are awesome. All right, number 4 now from 1996. This is produced by Kevin Army. That is the album Love Is Dead. This album features my favorite lineup of the band, Dr. Frank, along with Joel Reeder and Jim Pittman. This is the first album which features this lineup, and I believe that I'm fairly certain that this is probably the band's most popular or successful album. It certainly features their most popular song off of Spotify, which is Ba Ba Ba, which I really do like that song a lot. To me, though, this record is awesome. It's not quite as good as a couple of the records that are coming up in the catalog, but I mean, this record to me was the current record when I first discovered the band, and I bought this record not right when it came out, but it wasn't too long after it came out, and this was another one, much like Revenge is Sweet, that I just absolutely wore out this CD. If I had to pick a favorite song off this record, I mean, I do like Ba 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 Ba. I mean, that's obviously, I think that's probably their most popular song. I love the song Dumb Little Band. Hanging On To You is cool. The Future Isn't What It Used to Be. Deep, Deep Down. I love the song. This is another one that's tough. If I had to pick a favorite song off Love Is Dead, oh my God, I'm gonna say, I'll say that Prozac Moment, but it's tough because this album is the Jugs, and like I said before, if I'm not mistaken, if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would bet that that's probably the band's most popular and successful record, which is why I think in 1997, because this record came out in 1996, I think that's why they were sort of right on the cusp. They were right on the cusp of sort of reaching that next level. It didn't quite happen, as I think it just proves that life and the music industry in particular isn't fair, because a lot of bands, making it in the music industry I feel like a lot of times has very little to do with the music actually, itself. All right, number 3. This record is one that you may not have included on your ranking list, but I did, because it contains 7 songs. And here's the thing to me. 7 songs is basically an album. I mean, if this was Rush or Dream Theater or Kraftwerk or a band like that, this is an album. And it's one of my favorites in the catalog, if not one of my favorite albums of all time. So I'm including it. I don't really care what you think. If you don't like it, that thing right there is the door. And that is from 1994, produced by Kevin Army. That is the band's mini album /EP. And the Women That Love Them. Like I said originally, this record contained 7 songs. Now this is one of the reissues, which actually contains 8 songs, so it's even better. At least in my opinion. This album features, of course, Dr. Frank, along with Aaron Rubin on bass and Jim Pittman on drums, and every single song on this little mini album is among probably my favorites, in the entire Mr. T Experience catalog. It was also released later on with the additional, the special addition, and the special addition has 25 songs on it, which are all just awesome. I love the song Taping Up My Heart. I mean, every song on this album is the Jugs. I mean, My Stupid Life is awesome. I Believe in You, All My Promises, Checker Speech, We Hate All the Same Things. Oh my God. Now That You're Gone. I mean, if I had to pick a favorite song off of... That's tough. I mean, there's not a weakest song on this, so you don't even have to try and look for it. But man, if I had to pick oh my god, I'm gonna say it comes down to either We Hate All the Same Things or Now That You're Gone, because those are two of my probably two of my top 10 favorite Mr. T Experience songs of all time. So I'll say, oh my god, I'll say Now That You're Gone. But We Hate All the Same Things is amazing too. And on this reissue that came out not too long ago, actually, I don't think, they also included the song How'd the Date End, which is another one of my probably top 15 MTX songs of all time. So if you don't think that this record belongs on this ranking based on its relatively anorexic track listing, I couldn't possibly disagree with you more. Love this album. This is number 3. Like I said, it's only 7 songs mini album, but I'm throwing it on there. It's my ranking, my list. Oh my god, I'm still agonizing. I'll say Now That You're Gone. So good. We Hate All the Same Things is the Jugs also. All right, number 2. From 1990, this album was also produced by Kevin Army. That is Making Things with Light. This album is just start to finish. I mean, there is not a bad song on this entire album. You can look all you want. You can dig. You can hunt. You can get a truffle snorting hog. It isn't going to do you any good. There isn't a bad song on this entire album. This album features John and Alex along with Aaron Rubin on bass. This is a record that, again, talking about the artwork, I think one of their best album covers. As a kid, I had a Light Bright, very briefly. I believe I got it for Christmas, and it didn't last very long. I'm pretty sure I killed it not long after I took it out of the box. I had this tendency as a child not to necessarily take care of my belongings, and I remember I always wanted to get a second one, and my mom always held it over my head that I broke the first one I got, and she'd be goddamned if I was going to get a second one. But man, this album is just about as good as it gets, in my opinion, -1. But this album, oh my god, the songs on this record, it has What Went Wrong, She's No Rocket Scientist, What's in the Cuckoo Clock. I mean, every song is jugs on this one. This was a record I remember when I bought it too. I bought it, I think this was one of the later ones I bought as I became a fan. In terms of after I had bought several others, and I don't know why, but I always sort of thought this one wasn't going to be as good just based on the artwork, which I love. I don't know why I thought that as a young kid. I remember that though. I remember thinking, it was probably not as good. I love the song Zero, Pig Latin, Parasite, So Long Sucker, A Weekend in Hogborough, The Girl Who Still Lives at Home. Oh my god, I love that song. Send Me a Postcard. I mean, my favorite song of this record is easy, and that is Psycho Girl. Been down that road, son. Anyway, number 2 from 1990, as I mentioned before, this album features Dr. Frank along with John Alex and Aaron Rubin on bass. Any other artist, this would be a very impressive number 1, but we've reached number 1. And this album also came out in 1999, the same as Alcatraz. This was a record that I remember exactly how I caught wind of it. I was hanging out in Berkeley one day, and one of my friends / acquaintances, I don't know if he was a real friend of mine or not, but he was somebody I knew, but he approached me as I was kind of hanging around Telegraph, and he said, I heard that guy from that, he's like, did you hear about that guy from that band you love? And I love Mr. T Experience, and at the time I loved Mr. T Experience, but back in those days, my favorite band in the world was Generation X, and as an extension of that, I was obsessed with Billy Idol. So when he said, "Did you hear about that guy from that band you love?" my mind immediately flew to Billy Idol. Now, in 1999, Billy Idol, I think, was still sort of in his post-cyberpunk hibernation, if I'm not mistaken, and he had not put out a record since 1993. So I remember thinking, like, oh my God, is Generation X getting back together? Is Billy Idol finally going to do something and get off his can and put out a new record? And the guy told me, he's like, "No, that Mr. T band that you love." I was like, what? What about him? And he's like, "Oh, that band broke up, and their singer's putting out a solo record." And I remember thinking to myself, well, they just put out the record Alcatraz. In fact, I had seen them not too long before that, playing on what I assumed was the Alcatraz tour. So he basically, convinced me to follow him up to the Tower Records, which back in those days in Berkeley was right up from Telegraph Avenue, about a half block up from Telegraph Avenue. And we went in there, and back in those days at the Tower Records in Berkeley, they had above the cashier, they had this big blackboard, and it had all of the release of all of the upcoming album releases. And sure enough, there was an album up there that said Dr. Frank, Show Business Is My Life. And at this point in time, in 1999, I'm 22, 23 years old, and Mr. T Experience is one of my favorite bands of all time. They're my favorite contemporary band. They're my favorite local band, and I feel as if I'm totally out of the loop as to what's going on. All of a sudden, they just put out a record. I just had seen them not that long ago, and all of a sudden I felt as if my feet had been taken out from under me. I had no idea what was going on. So I get in the line, the checkout line, and this guy calls me over, and I'm not there to buy anything. He's like, "Help you?" And I was like, is that Dr. Frank? Like the Dr. Frank? And he looked at me sort of blankly. He said, "I don't know. Who's Dr. Frank?" And I couldn't explain to this guy who Dr. Frank was. I was at a loss. But sure enough, eventually I found out that it was Dr. Frank, as in the Dr. Frank, as in the Mr. T Experience Dr. Frank. And he was going to be releasing a solo album by the name of Show Business Is My Life. And I remember when this record came out, I went out and I bought it immediately. Now, of course, at this point in time, I was terrified that the Mr. T Experience had split up. That was my biggest fear. I thought because he was putting out a solo album, the band must have broken up. And that was my biggest fear. When I found out that Dr. Frank was putting out this solo record, I remember thinking, like, why a solo record? Why now? And what does this mean about the band? Is the band dead? The band can't be dead. The Mr. T Experience can't be dead. But I went out, I bought this record, I took it home and listened to it, and it just completely blew me away. This was a record that was easily my favorite record of 1999 at the time. Probably still is. This record is as good as anything I've ever heard, really. Apart from things by Morrissey and David Bowie. This is up there with pretty much everything I've ever heard. And I remember when this record first came out, I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, is it just going to be like another Mr. T Experience record? And I don't mean just another Mr. T Experience, because I'm a huge fan, but it's like, why is he doing a solo album? I don't understand why he's putting out this solo record. And as you go through this record, the very first song starts, and the first song on this record is called She Turned Out to Be Crazy, which is, lyrically and instrumentally and musically very much like a classic MTX song. So I remember I took the CD home, and I put this record on, and the first song started. And I thought, okay, yeah, Mr. T Experience, it's right in there. I like it. I'm a big fan. But as this record progresses, he goes through a lot of sort of stylistic changes. I think this song flexes his songwriting a little bit more than your average Mr. T Experience record. There's a lot of different sort of, there's a lot of musical diversity on this record. It goes in a lot of different directions. Every single song on this record is the Jugs. I can't even pretend that there's a weakest song on this record because every song on this album is the goods. I remember when I bought this record the first time on CD, I loved the artwork. I still do. It was very sort of minimalist, and it's very like kind of 1999 in a good way. It doesn't look dated, but it definitely kind of looks very like 1999. But it did scare me when this record came out. I did not want to think of the Mr. T Experience in the past tense, and now that I'm at the age I'm at now, I still don't want to think about the Mr. T Experience in the past tense. But this album has She Turned Out to Be Crazy, which, like I said, is a very much like a very straightforward MTX song. First time I heard the song, I was like, okay, cool. Mr. T Experience, I'm all in. I love it. But it goes in a lot of different directions. I love the song I Made You, I Can Break You, Knock Knock, Suicide Watch, She's Alright. She Alright is a really kind of weird, interesting, cool song. Ask Beth is awesome. Thinking of You is another very unique song. I'm in love with What's Her Name. I guess if I had to... I can't even say it. If I had to pick a... I use the term weakest extremely loosely here, just so you know. But if I had to pick a weakest song on this album, I think it would be I'm in Love with What's Her Name. I still like that song a lot. 2 Martinis From Now is awesome. Sad, Sad Shadow is a song, when I talked about this record in its entirety, that's a song that is beautifully written and beautifully played. It's one of those sort of Dr. Frank acoustic songs, and the song Sad, Sad Shadow really proves to me that when he wants to, Dr. Frank Portman is actually capable of being a very, very gifted, talented singer. His voice is beautiful on that song. The last song on this record is called This Isn't About You Anymore. If I had to pick a favorite song on this record, I mean, God. I mean, I'd say Bitter Homes and Gardens is pretty up there, but I'm going to go with Population Us because it's one of my probably top 3 favorite Mr. T Experience / Dr. Frank songs of all time. That song always reminds me of my wife. It's on every single cutesy little lovey playlist that I make for my wife. Population Us. Along with that song, Lovers of Loving Love by the Aquabats are 2 of my favorite songs that I put on playlists for my wife. But for me, easily number 1 from 1999. This record is a classic. This is a record that you have to own. If you don't own this record, I don't know what I can do for you. This record, and you have no excuse because this record was just recently reissued. So go out and at least get yourself a reissued copy of this. This is classic material that we are discussing here. So from 1999, number 1, Dr. Frank's solo album, Show Business Is My Life. Well, we've done it. We've gone through and we've ranked the catalog of one of my top 10 favorite bands of all time, the Mr. T Experience. This is the second time in about 2 weeks that we've talked about the Mr. T Experience, so I think I'll give them a couple days off. But rest assured that they will be back on this channel in a relatively short period of time. This band is never out of arm's reach as far as I'm concerned. This is a band that I still go back and listen to on the very heavy rotation. Like I said before, this is a band that every time I listen to them, I can't help but be sort of transported. This band is a musical time machine as far as I'm concerned. Every time I hear these songs, I can think back to memories of living in the Bay Area as just a wee lad. Anyway, man, I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, talk to you then.